Hi everyone, my name is Anchovies and welcome to my Chiori guide. This guide will teach you everything about our beloved seamstress, including her role, her kit, and her best builds. Without further delay, let's go ahead and jump right in. So starting with her role, her main role is to be an off-field geo DPS, with her secondary role being a quick swap DPS, and she mainly deals damage through her elemental skill. Diving a little bit into her kit, let's first go over her base stats. So for her base stats, she actually has the second highest base defense in the entire game, falling shortly only behind by Arataki Ito. This allows her to reach really high defense thresholds, and she also ascends with crit rate, which means that in terms of artifact substats, reaching high defense and crit stats are going to be a lot easier compared to other units. Transitioning over to her talents, starting with her normal attack talent, this is a typical attack scaling 4-hit combo, nothing significant to note whatsoever. Next is her elemental skill. Now this is a dual scaling ability, meaning that it scales with both her attack and her defense. Of course, it scales more with her defense though. It deals an upward thrust and then summons a Temoto doll. These dolls attack dealing AoE geo damage once every 3.6 seconds and last 17 seconds, which means that they attack 5 times per duration. The AoE of this ability is somewhat larger than Yolande's Elemental Burst or Hyperbloom cores. Then her second doll summons when a geo construct exists or is created. Now this doll's duration is independent from the initial doll, which means that you can slightly delay the summon of the second doll by summoning a geo construct slightly later. The main thing to note about this ability is that it does not snapshot, so trying to get things like Goro buffs or Noblesse Oblige on full uptime will not work because this ability is dynamic. Lastly is her Elemental Burst, and this just deals an instance of AoE geo damage. This is of course also a dual scaling ability which scales with both her attack and defense, and scaling more with her defense. It costs 50 energy, meaning that if you are trying to burst every rotation, it will not take too much energy requirements to do it every rotation. For talent priority, you mainly just want to level her elemental skill, as that is where the vast majority of her damage output is. Her burst can be leveled next, as it does still contribute nearly to about a quarter of her damage output. However, its damage alone isn't enough to where you necessarily need to use it every single rotation. That is purely just up to you. And then her normal attack talent can honestly just be left unleveled, because realistically, even when you level her normal attack talent and use her on-field playstyle, it actually deals less total DPS than her elemental burst in those rotations. So honestly, when it comes to trying to on-field Chiori, it's usually not worth it, at least at C0. Now onto her passives. Her first Ascension passive gives her 2 modes after she presses her elemental skill. So she either has her Tailor mode or her Tapestry mode. You can activate the Tailor mode when you do a normal attack after pressing her skill button, and when you activate this mode, she gets a Geo Infusion for 5 seconds. Now, do keep in mind that this infusion can be overridden with things like Bennett C6 or like Candace or Chungyun, so please keep that in mind. Whereas with her Tapestry mode, you can activate this mode when you press her elemental skill button again, and then after you do this, it'll swap to the next character in your roster. Now when this happens, Tapestry mode provides 2 extra coordinated attacks that deal equal damage to her elemental skill's upward thrust damage. And if you don't activate either of these modes by yourself, then it'll automatically trigger the Tailor mode by default. And then her 4th Ascension passive, this only works if you have a Geo construct on the team, so please keep that in mind. But whenever a Geo construct exists or is created, she will gain a 20% Geo damage bonus, which is a nice increase to her damage output, but again, requires a Geo construct to work. For things like rotations and combos, excluding the use of her elemental burst, as whether or not you use her burst is optional for most rotations, you typically want to start off with using her elemental skill, and you usually use her Tapestry mode, which is basically pressing her skill button again, which then swaps you to the next character. Now for this, you have the option of the next character being the person that summons the Geo construct, meaning that you're going to delay the second doll summon, or you already summon the construct first before swapping to Chiori, then double pressing her skill button and then swapping to the next on-field unit. And for Chiori's on-field playstyle, again, her burst is optional, but in this playstyle, it's a little bit more preferred since you really want to get out as much damage as possible. Then you cast her skill and then trigger the normal attack to activate her Tailor mode, and then you can either do the combo of 4 normal attacks, dashing, and then 3 normal attacks and a charge attack, or just doing a normal attack spam combo. Something to keep in mind with her Tapestry mode's coordinated attacks that I forgot to mention earlier is that they require the active character to do normal attacks, so please keep that in mind. So now let's proceed onto the discussion of Chiori versus Albedo, because this is going to be an obvious point that just really needs to be discussed and just get out of the way. So let's first mainly talk about the main strengths of Chiori in regards to Albedo. So the main strength that she definitely has over Albedo is purely just damage output. She has a higher damage ceiling than Albedo. Even when you only have 1 doll on her, there's still some situations where she does actually outdamage him, so even in those instances, she's generally just a quote-unquote better Albedo. And she also has the benefit of being dual scaling versus Albedo's split scaling, because for reference, Albedo's elemental skill does scale with defense, but the initial cast of his skill, as well as his elemental burst, scales with attack. And this does also include the follow-up attacks on his burst, whereas with Chiori, everything scales with both attack and defense. So she has the blatant advantage of not having to worry about split scaling and having to manage all of that within her abilities. Now, of course, just because that she does output more damage does not necessarily mean that she has no weaknesses. Her main weakness is of course the fact that she does not really snapshot any of the buffs that she receives, meaning that everything that happens with Chiori's damage is purely dynamic. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing in and of itself. However, it's just unfortunate because let's say you wanted to get like a Goro buff and have full uptime on it, well, that's just not going to be the case for Chiori. And the second thing is regarding her relatively weak and slow application, especially without her second doll or having her C1. Because for example, Albedo does around 10 instances of Geo application, assuming a standard 20-second rotation, whereas with Chiori she has 7 instances, 5 being from her doll hits and then 2 being from the coordinated attacks from her passive. This adds up to a total of 7 instances of Geo application. And this is especially important to note when you take into consideration the frequency at which they apply their element, because for Albedo, he applies the element once every 2 seconds, whereas with Chiori, it's once every 3.6 seconds per doll. And this is notably relevant for Navia teams, and this is why when we get into the Constellations section in just a second, you're going to realize just how important having that second doll is, especially for a team like that, where application is a little more important to get those crystallized shards to maximize Navia's damage output. Now, taking a dive into her constellations, so her constellation 1 increases the doll's AoE and removes the construct limit for her second doll, which is huge for Navia in Noelle double Geo teams. Now, do keep in mind that the AoE wording is misleading in this ability because this refers to the search range for enemies, not the ability's damage AoE itself. Her constellation 2, where it's 10 seconds after using her elemental burst, a Kinu doll is summoned once every 3 seconds. Now, this will deal damage that is equivalent to a percentage of her Tomoto doll's damage, and it will disappear after 1 attack or 3 seconds, which gives Chiori 4 additional damage instances, which is a significant increase to her personal damage. And in my opinion, I would highly recommend getting this constellation if you do plan to vertically invest in Chiori. Her C3 increases her elemental skill level by 3. Now, although it is a simple constellation, this is actually a really sizable damage increase since her elemental skill does deal most of her total damage output. Her C4 is after 8 seconds of triggering her first Ascension passives, Tailor or Tapestry mode, normal charge or plunging attacks that hit enemies summons a Kinu doll. This has a 1-second cooldown and up to 3 Kinus can be summoned per passive effect. Now, of course, this provides up to 3 additional instances of skill damage, which of course drastically increases Chiori's personal damage yet again. Her C5 increases her elemental burst talent level by 3. Now, this doesn't matter too much because her elemental burst by itself does not contribute to a ton of her damage output, and this is honestly a constellation you're only really getting if you're going for C6 anyways. And speaking of her C6, for her C6, after triggering her Ascension 1 passive's Tailor effect, her elemental skill cooldown is decreased by 12 seconds. Then the damage dealt by her normal attacks is increased by 235% of her defense. Now, this immediately enables on-field DPS Chiori and makes it viable and good. In terms of priorities, you mainly want to go for C2 if you're looking for, I would say, the best constellation to get for her, mainly just because this provides the most significant increase when you don't take into account things like constructs. However, if you are somebody who is mainly using Chiori for like Navia or double Geo teams, then I would say the main one would actually then probably be her C1, just because it ignores that Geo construct limit. Let's now move on to artifacts. So the first artifact set that you can use for Chiori is 4-piece Golden Troop. This is a really good set, especially if you don't already have a good Husk of Opulent Dreams set for her. It is a resin efficient domain because it also shares its place with Marchesi Hunter, which both sets are good on a wide variety of characters, so regardless, you'll gain some benefit from farming the domain. It provides skill damage percent buffs for Chiori and can marginally outperform or underperform versus Husk. Really just depends on the situation and the buffs that you're given, as well as the weapons. Another 4-piece that you can use is of course 4-piece Husk of Opulent Dreams. This is already a good set that you can just immediately equip on her if you already have a good one. But if you don't, then it's just better to probably farm Golden Troop and then Strongbox to maybe get a good Husk set. This set provides defense in both the 2-piece and the 4-piece effect, as well as a Geo damage bonus in the 4-piece effect. So in the context of either of these two sets and which one to use, it's really just a case-by-case scenario. However, I will say that when it comes to Husk, it usually tends to outperform if you are, say, like bursting every rotation, or you have her C2+, where you are incentivized to use her elemental burst more frequently. Outside of these 4 pieces, you can of course use 2-piece variations of Husk, Golden Troop, and Archaic Petra. For main stats, you usually want to just opt for a Defense Sands, and then either a Geo Damage or a Defense Goblet depending on your substats, and oftentimes you'll run a crit circlet. However, there are cases like say if you're running Harbinger of Dawn and you have really good crit stats, where it can be justifiable to run a defense circlet. For subset priorities, you mainly just want to aim to get as much defense percent and crit as you can, followed by energy recharge, and then flat stats like defense or attack. Moving on to her weapons, we of course have her signature weapon being her main one. It has a low base attack and a high crit stat, which is good for her since building attack isn't a high priority for her. It gives defense percent and normal and charge attack damage bonuses in her passive effect, which benefits both of her playstyles and makes this a perfect weapon for Chiori. Next up is Primordial Jade Cutter, again, another low base attack and high crit stat weapon. The crit rate is not as beneficial since, as mentioned earlier, she does ascend with crit rate. However, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. And then of course, the HP to attack conversion gives a minor damage increase, but nothing significant. Next up is R5 Cinnabar Spindle. Now this is of course a really good option and generally her best 4-star option outside of something like maybe R5 Wolf Fang. However, it is event limited, so if you don't have the weapon, womp womp, that's too bad. Now this does have 100% uptime if you only have one doll. However, if you have 2 dolls that are active, you're only really going to get partial uptime, mainly because of the passive's 1.5 second cooldown for its skill damage buff increase. Now I am aware of the fact that you can actually trigger the passive effect on multiple hits if the delay isn't too long. However, if you spawn both of the dolls simultaneously, the delay is going to be too long for both of them to benefit from the passive effect. Now of course, you can do a workaround of sorts of this by delaying the second doll spawn time. However, this may result in a DPS loss because of the fact that you're actively waiting 1.5 seconds to delay the spawn. Next up is R5 Harbinger of Dawn. It gives a crit damage stat and gives a crit rate increase in its passive. However, like we always mention, it does rely on her staying above 90% HP to keep that increase, so please keep that in mind. This means that you probably shouldn't use this weapon if you're using her in something like arena teams, or if you're against enemies like Corrosion without a healer. And outside of these specific weapons, any crit weapon will work for her, so things like Mist Splitter, Haran, or like a highly refined Wolf Fang will be really good for her. And especially Wolf Fang, although she doesn't benefit too much from the passive effect, just the stats alone makes it just as good, if not in some situations better than R5 Cinnabar Spindle at R5. And lastly, let's now go over her teams. So the first team archetype that I'm going to be going over is things like Navia teams. So this includes teams where it's Navia, Chiori, a Pyro, Hydro, Electro, or Cryo sub DPS, and then a flex unit of the same elemental type. Now in these teams, she does deal equivalent damage like Albedo due to the fact that she does have one doll. However, if you have her at C1, then she significantly improves this team's output, mainly because of the fact that now she gets these 2 dolls without that Geo Construct limit, which is why I was emphasizing the fact that getting C1 is a higher priority if you are mainly going to use her in these teams. And like I mentioned in Chiori's weakness section, you might run into application issues with Chiori, especially after you run out of her coordinated attacks from her passive effect. However, she outputs enough damage to where it's still justifiable to use her in these teams, even over Albedo. And then of course, the second team archetype is Mono Geo. This is of course composed of teams like Ito or Noelle as the main DPS, then Goro, Chiori, and then a flex unit. This is definitely her best team where she effectively replaces Albedo. Now of course there are cases where they can be used together, however do note that if you do plan to use them together, you're probably going to have to sacrifice something, whether it's healing, shielding from Zhongli, or some form of buffing. You're going to have to probably sacrifice something if you want to use them together, but if we're going to keep it a buck, honestly Chiori's pure existence is to be a Albedo replacement in Mono Geo teams, so that's just the sad reality of the way that they made this unit. Alright, and that's going to conclude this video. So thank you so much for watching, and if you found this video helpful, then be sure to drop a like and subscribe down below for more content like this. And until the next video, bye bye.